Thank you very much for the introduction. I very much appreciate it. This is an opportunity, really, for me to share my own work and also to say something about my own area of research with deaf colleagues and how we've collaborated and what we've achieved over the past few months and years. Before I start, I just want to say a big thank you to Adam Shembury, because he recommended that I present in this arena, at this series. So I want to say thank you very much to Adam for recommending that I come and present here for you today. Also, I just want to make a little bit of an apology linked with interpreters. I had planned to set up a separate screen for the interpreter, but just before we started, we tried to get access for her on Zoom and it was blocked. So it means myself and my interpreter will be sharing one screen. And later on, we'll have a discussion with questions and answers. So we may have to swap seats a little bit. So I feel it's not fully professional, but I'm sure you understand the logistics here and the technical failings that occur that have led to this situation. So to be honest with you, I don't know what your backgrounds are, what your knowledge of sign language is, what you know about the deaf community. So I thought, first of all, it would be worth explaining a little bit about the background of the deaf community, of sign language, and so you have the necessary information which will come into play later as I go on through my presentation. So sign language is really have been researched for about 60 years or so, and now it's clear that sign languages and spoken languages are very much of equal value. And we think about these references. I thought, should I put references in? And then I thought, no, actually, the proof has been there. The point has been made. So hopefully you can accept this statement that sign languages and spoken languages are very much equal. And so from my own experience growing up, I know that if a person is unable to hear, that sign language is a huge benefit and it produces all sorts of benefits. Unfortunately, in terms of sign language, people don't necessarily value it, or it isn't valued by society. The language can be dismissed or ignored, or people think, you know, maybe they make the wrong assumptions about sign language. So attitudes tend to be quite negative, or there are stigmas that occur in relation to sign languages. And here in the UK recently, I feel there have been some improvements, but there are still, I think, in terms of deaf children and access to education, improvements to be made, especially in the early years as they're growing up. There's a critical period. And I think still in this critical period, this access is questionable. So, you know, in terms of quality education for deaf children, I think that's still very much a question at the moment. And I will add also that I have, you know, sign language has tactile sign language is imperative for deaf blind people. It's not an area I'm going to touch on much, but I want to mention it and just make the point of mentioning it because it is extremely important for the deafblind community. And I think also I wanted to give you some background linked with sign language research recently and the discussion about our responsibilities, that we must do certain things. So one big discussion, one important topic is linked with language deprivation. And you know, this is extremely important. You know, deaf children have a right to access language. And so there's an example here, this quote on the slide. It says that, you know, we researchers, we must bear that responsibility, not to only research, but to really share and to challenge and to support. It doesn't matter really if the researcher is deaf or hearing, they must endeavour to do this. I'd like you to read this quote from Henna and Lilo Martin, 2021. I'll just give you the opportunity to read that. So as linguists who profit from the study of sign languages, we have an obligation to ensure that the wishes and needs of the communities with whom we work are respected. In this case, our responsibilities include ensuring that the families of deaf and hard of hearing children also have access to signs. Thus, dear reader, we hope that you too will advocate for deaf and hard of hearing children to sign. And also, we want to research different spoken languages and sign languages. We must think about the communities in this, the people who use those languages. And one interesting idea for me is that long-term community engagement. And that's why I've seen some sign language research. It happens, but it's not really in accordance and in relation to the community, and they're not engaging long term. So, for example, there was one research that took place, and it was based in Indonesia. And the aim of that was to compare lexicons. So various different communities in Indonesia looking at their lexicons. But the person themselves, I think they visited maybe 25 or 30 different cities in Indonesia. They filmed this data, they collected the data. And then I think in terms of time, they had to fly. You had to think about the money involved, the energy of completing this. I think really the deaf people themselves, they saw someone who came. They thought, well, they don't know my sign language. They're asking me to do something. So, okay, I'll do that. And then the person leaves and they never see that person again. So they don't really understand what the research is about and what the research findings were and why the research was important. So this is called parachute science, or fly in, fly out, or drive-by linguistics. So I think it's really important for us linguists, us researchers, to not exploit disabled people, disabled communities, and profit for our own gain and our own publications and just simply leave. I wanted to add something as well about English in the academic world, because I feel maybe that this point you understand, of course, because English is so powerful. So for people who don't have English as a first, second or third language, there are difficulties in terms of access in academia. But for deaf people, if you think about educational barriers as well, in addition to this, it's an additional challenge. So one example 2 weeks ago was I went to Norway, whereas I was involved in a PhD examination for a student. And the interpreter there was explaining, the Norwegian Sign Language interpreter was saying, well, here in Norway, the number of interpreters who can interpret from English to Norwegian Sign Language in the whole of Norway is only 5 in the whole of the country, interpreting between English and Norwegian Sign Language. So that's a huge barrier for any deaf student who wants to go to university in Norway, who wants to access knowledge, who wants to do research, because how do they access the lectures, the information? You know, if the agency says, oh no, we don't have any interpreters who interpret from English to Norwegian Sign Language. So that's a huge barrier. That's Norway. We think Norway is, you know, far above and beyond us and excels in all sorts of different ways, but it seems that they too are facing challenges. So technology may help us in the future. I think it's been a big help so far, and I hope it continues to be a help in terms of English and allowing more deaf people to access education and academia. But academia, we need to think about how we make our knowledge accessible as well. So, you know, whose knowledge is it? You know, and the value that's placed on that knowledge is important. one positive development so far is that there have been vlogs, different vlogs, meaning that people can publish information in different formats. So, for example, information in sign language. And I would like to see more of that. I would like to see more of that over the coming years. So that's a little bit of background. I now want to move on and talk about my own research and my own research journey and how I became involved in this research area. So I feel very lucky because I was a volunteer, an organisation which I'm sure many of you will know, VSO, Voluntary Services Overseas. And I decided that I wanted to volunteer with the deaf community. So I thought, in terms of my experience as a deaf person growing up, I thought, you know, there are many benefits that I can offer, but I became aware that overseas, maybe people's experiences would be quite different for deaf people. So I wanted the opportunity to learn from other deaf people about their experiences. So VSO accepted me as a volunteer and they offered me the opportunity to go to Indonesia. So I lived in Java in Indonesia for 2 years. I was working there for 2 years with 2 deaf organisations. So you can see the photos here. That's the last one is just saying goodbye, just as I was leaving, actually, with the 2 deaf organisations these photos are. It was a little bit of a challenge to find me, actually, in these photos. It's a bit like Where's Wally or Where's Wally? You can hopefully find me in the photo, but it is a little bit of a challenge. But this was a hugely positive experience for me. I learned so much, and hopefully I can share something of that because I learned so much from this experience, which meant that afterwards I felt that I couldn't ignore this experience and go back to life as it was before. I thought it was impossible. I needed to find something, a way of continuing that relationship with my deaf friends in Indonesia. And also I wanted to use the knowledge that I'd gleaned about the culture, the linguistics that I'd learned about. I wanted to use that. So I decided to do a PhD. So the PhD was here at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, UCLan, as we refer to it as, because it has the institute, which is called ILANS. So ILANS is the International Institute of Sign Languages and Deaf Studies. So I joined ILANS to do a PhD, and that was 14 years ago. And now I am the director of ILANS. So really, it's been quite a journey over these 14 years. And things have changed over those 14 years a lot. So it's very interesting to look back and reflect. So I picked ILANS really because the aim was I wanted some high quality research. But what was important was that it must have a positive impact for the deaf community. For the deaf world. So I thought, well, which community? So it's the Global South. And I was focusing on the Global South. And I thought that was, especially at that time, I felt really it was imperative. It was a good match for me. So you can see here this photo. This is from a while ago now. We had deaf and hearing people mixture in the team. Everybody could sign. And, you know, over time, I think ILANS, in terms of deaf students studying MAs or MPhils, there have been 6. And studying PhDs, who've completed PhDs, there have been 4. So I feel at that time, it felt so exciting, a very exciting place to be, a mixture of different communities and cultures. And I learned a lot, gained a lot from this experience. So my own PhD was, you won't be surprised, it was still looking at the community in Indonesia, and it was comparing two cities in Indonesia, different islands. So the cities' names are Solo and Makassar. So it meant that I was building up a corpus of free conversational data. And altogether, there were 37 deaf people who were involved in this. But also, I started to work with deaf people who helped me to look at the data and analyze the data. So I'd say, oh, can you see this data? Can you explain from your opinion, your intuition, what it's showing? And I would work with those deaf people. So that's islands. And at that time, as I said, it was very exciting, but it faced challenges really in terms of some systemic barriers that existed. So, for example, tuition fees escalating over time, and international students as well. You know, they may think, oh, right, this university, you know, for disabled students, you'd think, oh, it's great. They can access a lot, but for international students, that's not the case. So for disabled students, the Disabled Students Allowance in the UK, they have a disabled students allowance to access interpreter provision, language support for any academic writing. If you're from overseas, there's this DSA support is not available. So, you know, it means if you're overseas, you're a student and you're coming to the UK, it's a huge fee, but there's no support. So it means there's this extra element to trying to sort out your support as well. So it means for us that we needed to think about a different way and a different model of how we worked. We felt really that deaf students, in terms of flying here, staying here, studying here and researching here, was no longer viable. And we needed to think about a different way of approaching things. So we decided to set up research hubs. So the focus would be focusing our energies on these research hubs, which meant that it would be based in their own home countries as well. So we decided to set up the hubs in, first of all, Indonesia. I mean, luckily, through my PhD research, I met with one deaf Indonesian man, and we became very close. We had a really good working relationship. So I wanted to share something from his experiences. So I've got a quote here from Mohammed, taken from an interview that was conducted with Mohammed in 2018, and this was published in 2022. So I'll just allow you all to read that. So Mohammed said, as a volunteer, you talked about sign language, but that didn't make an impression on me. It was when you came not as a volunteer, but as a researcher, and you were filming people signing. You filmed me, and then I suddenly saw myself communicating. I'd never seen myself signing before. And I had this sudden epiphany. I went from trying to use speech to being a passionate user of sign language. I no longer cared what hearing people thought when they saw me signing. So I feel this is a really good example of how, you know, when I started my research, it seemed great. It was making an impact, a positive impact on some deaf people that I was working with, and I was extremely happy about that. And the benefits in terms of those relationships then amounted to setting up this research hub. So the research hub, the name of it is Poupette. This is the sign for it, Poupette. It's the Indonesian sign. It's the Deaf Research Centre. And it's with Mohammed Pupet that we set this up in 2014. So it's now been successfully running for 10 years. So this is the opening event for Pupet. And obviously it's been ongoing since then. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how this philosophy in terms of research hubs works. And one of the problems for us here in Ireland that we've identified has been funding and how we make the funding work for us. Because always what tends to happen is you get funding, you think, great, you set something up for deaf people, you recruit the people accordingly, and then the funding ends. The funding dries up and everything kind of finishes and kind of falls apart. And then there might be some kind of episodes of further funding, intermediate gaps. So, you know, deaf people may leave, and really you've got this funding security situation, which doesn't always happen. The problem I feel is that it's not sustainable, this method, and you can't necessarily build or sustain things in this way. So the concept of the hub was to have this continuous funding, staff working on a continuous basis in a country, meaning that it could be built up over time, then knowledge and skills would build up over time, and those resources would develop alongside that. But the challenge, of course, has been that, you know, where do you get this funding from? So we've had 10 years where we've been looking for funding and pots of funding. And we've had lots of funding from here, from UCLAN, lots of internal funding linked with various different applications that have been submitted over time. And it's become like a foundation. And then this is built up from there. So my early career research fellowship from an organisation called the Leverhulme Trust. That was 2016 to 2018. And that was great. That was a huge relief because over those 3 years, it meant I didn't have to continually look for funding. I thought, you know, it put me in a really good place while I had that. But then again, after this ended, I was back looking for funding. And now again in 2023, I started the ELDP funding project. This is the Endangered Language Documentation Programme. So again, there was this sense of relief because it's a period of 3 years that I have this funding for. But then you're thinking about how to continue beyond this. And there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes. So I mentioned earlier about, I got some postdoc funding, and it meant in terms of Indonesian Sign Language, Bisindo it's referred to as, it meant that I could increase the corpus. So before I was focusing on 2 areas, and I then added 4 more areas to my research. So you can see from this map, those 4 additional areas that I researched postdoctorally. Which means now that the Bisindo corpus altogether has 131 deaf people involved in it, involved in the corpus. So in terms of resources, this is great. And in terms of has it been used well so far, I think that's a question. There's definitely more that we can do with this corpus in terms of resources. I think it's underused at the moment. And one of the problems is time and project management and all that comes with project management. But this project I really like because I was able to go to different places, which meant that I could really engage with the local deaf community in these places. And I love this. You can see the photos I showed Mohammed reflecting on his own experiences and how he saw himself signing, and from that came this pride in his own language and his confidence. His mind changed, this mindset that he had previously. And now I can see the impact on different communities in Indonesia. But I have challenges also. So, for example, Ambon in the east of Indonesia is very far from the central capital, Jakarta. So I think it's 3.5 hours flight or 3-hour flight from the capital, Jakarta. So it's quite far. And I feel it's a challenge in terms of how the deaf community there, how we engage with them, how we support them. It's difficult because in terms of, I've been twice and that's it. Twice is better than none or once, but it's not enough. And Mohammed has reflections, which I want to share with you now. And hopefully this video will work for you and you'll be able to watch Mohammed. To be honest, we know how important it is when you see the deaf communities in the places we have been doing our research, but we're aware of the challenges, the distances involved, but also the challenges of keeping in touch. And there has been quite a lot of miscommunication as we try to communicate by SMS. So that's an example from Mohammed about that very challenge of distance. And we both are aware that the deaf community need more because they've been affected by civil conflict. I think it was about 20 years ago, the community is still broken from this. So we're still thinking of how we go forward and support this community. That's still a challenge. But we still feel that it's a big benefit really for the project. So Mohammed again will explain about how this project has affected him. To be honest, we know how important it is to support the deaf communities in the places where we have been, where we've been doing our research. But we're aware of the challenges, the distances involved. But also, sorry, that was, I think I'm repeating the first clip I showed. I'm going to show again with a new clip. Oh, my experiences in the field have been very useful for me. I've been exposed to so many different variants and different ways of signing things from men and women, older signers, younger signers, different styles and ways of using the sign space. I learned such a lot. Now I interpret on one of the television news channels. I've met so many signers with different strengths. So as I interpret, I have this in mind, and I try to sign as visually as I can, in a way that they might understand. Without the experience that I've had, I would just give it my best shot. But having seen how people sign in the corpus, I'm more aware of what they might understand. Research on Basindo is so important. This becomes part of how we convince other people about our language. They always ask, do you have any research, any data? The research that we've done in different regions helps to shed light on our language, Basindo. So Mohammed feels that, you know, this is a very convincing argument. I think this is very positive in terms of what Mohammed has got out of this whole experience. So now this funding from ELDP means we can continue our research. And this funding for documentation is looking at endangered languages in Bali and Java, in West Java. So we have Indonesia, we have the Indonesian hub. Then in 2018, we set up a deaf research hub we set up in India in 2019. And now we have the third hub, which is based in the Caribbean. We got some funding from AHRC to set up a research hub in the Caribbean. And I'll explain a little bit about that, how that's happened. So you can see the people here who are involved in the project. So we have 3 deaf people. They're from Trinidad and Tobago, from Jamaica, and also from Puerto Rico. And it's interesting for me because for a long time, people were asking me, do your Indonesian work's going well. What about other countries? Will you also do work like that in other countries? And I thought, yes, I want to, but I became aware that, it was in terms of a new community and working with communities, it's very easy to work with the wrong people because in a new community, I wouldn't know the people very well. And so there was a risk maybe of engaging with the wrong people in those communities. And by wrong, I mean that maybe, working with a person, they themselves may be oppressing other people, or their way of working might not empower the community. So for me, I felt very lucky because I met with 2 very important people. One was the man in the purple shirt here. This is Ian, who's from Trinidad and Tobago, with Ben Braithwaite, who's an English hearing man who is based in Trinidad and Tobago. So they both came over to the UK to present, and I went to this presentation, I met them, and then through that, we started working together. Ben and Ian have their own network in the Caribbean, so it meant that I was able to get into that community quite smoothly and successfully. So now we have this new research hub, which is based in the Caribbean. So we are working together at the moment. It's a 2-year funding grant. And the plan is in the same as Indonesia. We want to continue this. We want to sustain this so that in terms of knowledge and skills, they can be developed over time. And one very important thing that we're doing is linked with documenting the process of how we research and what the benefits are, what the challenges are, what we face as we go through this process. That the project has 4 publications. One publication will be talking about how we, in sign language only, which is new for me. I mean, in the past, it's always been written and then we've translated it into sign language. But the aim of this one publication is for it to be fully from sign language and in sign language only. And so we need to think about how we conceptualize this, how we structure it, our arguments and so on, and how we present those in sign language. So through the project, we have these interviews. We will interview each other. We have interviewed each other, and there will be these video diaries. So when we come together, we have these video diaries that we're doing. So we sign to camera, and then I'll just show an example. There's no subtitles, but you can just see us reflecting and signing to camera. And this we'll be able to edit in time, which will become a publication. I'm very excited because I have never worked this way before, so it's been a challenge for me. So you can see the team members here reflecting on, we're in Jamaica here for this, and it had been one day where we were working on country sign. So they have rural sign language for this particular area, which is called country sign. And so we're reflecting on this day because we had a whole day focused on country sign and chatting about it and talking to community members, and we're just feeding back to camera in terms of what we've learned in these video diaries here that you can see. And I think this work is really important. I think we are thinking about policy we're thinking about law, we're thinking about how the Caribbean has different disability acts and how it's possible with those acts for them to become more inclusive and more accessible for deaf people and deaf-blind people. The Caribbean has so many hurricanes, volcanoes, natural disasters, climate change is affecting these countries a lot in the Caribbean. So it's really important that deaf people have access to the right information. And we know with hurricanes, people know that they're coming, preparations can be made. And hurricanes afterwards, it's quite interesting. Recently, there was a hurricane in Jamaica in July. And the problem now is about rehabilitation, is about rebuilding. And deaf people need that access to information, but still don't have it. So they don't necessarily know where to go for support. So this is still a huge challenge. There are so many challenges linked with the language in terms of language access and language policy. So we're trying to think about how our research can have a positive impact on policy. It's also really important for us always to engage with local communities at events. So we'll set events up, tell people to come along, and then we'll explain about what we're doing. I think this is a very short clip. Again, there's no captions here, but I'll just show you the clip so you can get an impression of the event. And also linked with the project, we have the Sign 10 conference, which is happening in December, and it's happening in Trinidad and Tobago. So we're really excited about this conference. It's a very special conference because it's a full sign language conference. So it's not about getting access through interpreters. It's all deaf and hearing people engaging in the conference through sign language. So I'm just working on the programme and the plan for that at the moment, the topics, the people who will be coming to be part of that, and it really is very exciting. So it means that through our research and through our Research Hub strategy, we see so many different people in India, Indonesia and the Caribbean and here in the UK. So you can see the faces of the people engaged in these hubs. They could be studying, working under our projects, or have another remit, another engagement with islands. So you can see all the many faces here on this slide. And I've been setting up these monthly meetings, which means that somebody from Indonesia and somebody from Jamaica and somebody from Indonesia and India can have a discussion, this beautiful discussion. And that, you know, often the best ways of kind of solving issues can be to bring those people together. It's a beautiful South-South, global South connection. And I feel it's really important. I think in the future, it's all going to be about making connections and allowing people to make those connections and improving things through that shared knowledge and that wealth of knowledge which is gained over time. So my final slide really is just a summary of things that I've learned, what I've learned through my work with the deaf community and deaf activism. So I think what's really important is having that engagement with the deaf community, having the time and the energy to do that. Many universities, you know, and funding, people don't necessarily recognise that it's necessary. I think UCLan has been great. They've supported and funded us a lot over the past few years. And I've said before, you know, it's easy to work with the wrong people and empower the wrong people. So it means maybe I've avoided things a little bit too much, or I've been a little bit too cautious. And I recognise that, you know, deaf people have had trauma through the way that people have engaged with them in the past. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. So engaging with the community and building those trusting relationships takes time, but it is worth it. And my way is about trying to sow the seeds, trying to plant the seeds and seeing how people respond, and then adjusting accordingly and building up that working relationship together. I think you must, you know, be aware of these different culture challenges, but you must be prepared to do things a different way. And the final thing I would say is there's always hope. You know, if something happens, it fails or goes wrong, we accept it and we look for a different way, an alternative way. That is my advice for what it's worth. So I will stop now. I don't know who you are, what you think, and I'd like to engage with you through some questions and some discussions.